Kambalik, capital of the Yuan Empire. 1 hour before the gates seal for the night. 1294, the air is so cold it cracks. In the grain quarter, you stand before 20 cartloads of winter wheat. Your entire year. Your life's work. A northern merchant, a man named Wei, you understand the language of silver, the satisfying weight of it in your palm. But the man in front of you, an officer of the Great Khan, doesn't offer silver. He presses a single sheet of mulberry bark paper into your hand. It's light, almost weightless. But his eyes are heavy. The black script is dense, unfamiliar. The scarlet square of Kublai Khan's seal seems to burn in the fading light. He doesn't draw his sword. He doesn't have to. The inscription on the note does the talking. It hisses the penalty for refusal. Death. The order is simple: move the grain to the front by sunrise. Feed the Khan's army. And do it for this, promise. Behind you, your men watch, their breath pluming in the air. The roads will be iron hard with frost in an hour. An hour after that, they'll be impassable. The choice is yours. Trust the paper, or test the steel. This single sheet of paper is our evidence. It's a witness to a revolution. And following it reveals how a simple technology of bark and ink became the ultimate tool of power, capable of building empires, feeding armies, and burning entire civilizations to the ground. Let's put this piece of paper under the microscope. The fibers are from the inner bark of the mulberry tree, tough and resilient. They were soaked in lye, beaten into a watery slurry by tireless workers in imperial workshops, then lifted from the vats on delicate bamboo screens. Each sheet was sized with starch, a secret recipe that allowed it to drink the ink without bleeding, to hold a line as sharp as a blade's edge. This wasn't just paper, it was a feat of engineering. The ink itself smelled of pine soot and animal glue, a scent that filled the halls of the Secretariat. And the seal, the vermilion seal, was the icon of power. Made from precious cinnabar, it wasn't just an imprint, it was the physical presence of the absent emperor, Kublai Khan. It was his voice, his will, made manifest. For the merchant Wei, this single sheet represented an impossible wager. He was being asked to believe that this fragile object held the same value as 20 carts of grain, a treasure guarded like a dowry. It was a test of faith, not in a god, but in a system. A system enforced by the silent threat of the officer whose felt boots stood firm on the frozen ground. The stakes couldn't be higher. For Wei, it was honor against survival. For the empire, it was a grand experiment. Could belief, stamped in ink, turn bark into bread and feed an army on the march? This is the central question of our investigation. Can a promise, backed by fear, replace the cold, hard reality of metal and memory? And if it can, for how long? To understand the power in that merchant's hand, we have to travel back over 1,000 years. The official court history of the Han dynasty pins the invention of paper to a single man, the eunuch Kai Luan, around the year 105 AD. The story goes that he perfected a recipe of mulberry fiber, old rags, and hemp waste, presenting his creation to the emperor and changing the world. It's a neat story. A story of a lone genius. But the truth is messier, and far more interesting. Archaeologists have found scraps of paper in China dating back 2 centuries before Kai Luan. The reality is that paper wasn't an invention, it was an evolution. It was born in countless anonymous workshops, a gradual refinement by craftsmen tinkering with fibers and vats. Kai Luan wasn't the inventor, he was the one who standardized it, who made it efficient enough for the hungry gears of the imperial bureaucracy. Before paper, the Chinese Empire ran on bamboo strips, heavy, clumsy, and difficult to transport. A single book could fill an entire cart. The other option was silk, beautiful and light, but ruinously expensive. Paper was the answer. It was cheap. It was light. It could be mass-produced. Suddenly, the empire had a new operating system. Orders could travel faster. Taxes could be recorded in more detail. Histories, which were once the exclusive property of the court, could be copied and stored. Paper was the hard drive of the ancient world, and China had just cornered the market. For centuries, the secret of its production was a jealously guarded state secret. A strategic advantage as potent as iron smelting or silk weaving. But secrets have a way of getting out. And this one would be spilled on a battlefield, hundreds of miles to the west. The year is 751. The Talas River, in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. 2 colossal empires collide, the Tang dynasty of China and the expanding Abbasid Caliphate. The battle itself is a swirl of dust, steel, and blood. But the most important consequence of this clash wasn't decided by generals. It was decided by a handful of captives. Imagine a man named Li, a master papermaker from Chengdu, his hands stained with the slurry of mulberry bark. He's not a soldier. He's a craftsman. He's captured on the battlefield, chained, and marched west along the Silk Road. His destination, the glittering city of Samarkand. For Li, it's a tragedy. He's a prisoner of war, a world away from his home. But for the Abbasid Caliphate, Li and his fellow captured artisans are a prize more valuable than any jewel. In Samarkand, they are put to work. Their knowledge, once a Chinese state secret, is now the seed of a new industry. Soon, the first paper mills outside of China spring up, powered by the rivers that flow through the city. The paper they produce, made from flax and linen rags, is a revelation. It's cheaper and more practical than parchment, which was made from scraped animal skin, and far superior to papyrus, which was brittle and couldn't be folded. Within a single generation, the bureaucracy of the Islamic world is transformed. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom becomes a vast repository of knowledge, its shelves groaning with books on mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, all copied onto cheap, abundant paper. The empire's chanceries, its centers of government, swell with clerks producing tax registers, land surveys, and military orders. Paper allows the caliphate to build a sophisticated administrative machine, a state that can see and remember everything within its vast borders. The secret was out. The technology was spreading. And with each new mill, in Damascus, in Cairo, in Sicily, the world was being rewritten. Now, let's jump forward 500 years, to the town of Fabriano, in the mountains of Italy. Here, another revolution is taking place, a quieter one, but just as profound. The Italians, having learned the craft of papermaking from the Arab world, are adding their own ingenious twists. Listen closely. That rhythmic, thumping sound is a water-powered trip hammer, a machine that pounds linen and hemp rags into pulp with relentless efficiency, replacing the back-breaking labor of men. But the real genius of Fabriano is something you can only see when you hold a sheet of their paper up to the light. A watermark. A ghost-like image pressed into the paper itself by a twisted wire on the mold. At first, it's just a craftsman's mark, a symbol of a guild's pride, a guarantee of quality. But merchants and bankers quickly realize its true potential. A watermark is a security feature. An anti-forgery device. In a world of burgeoning long-distance trade, where a bill of exchange written in Venice needed to be trusted in London, the watermark was a revolution in trust. It was a way to verify that a document was genuine. The artisans of Fabriano also perfected the use of gelatin sizing, dipping each sheet in a bath of rendered animal hides. This made the paper less absorbent and stronger, able to stand up to the sharp quill of a notary and, later, the immense pressure of a printing press. Think about what this means. Paper is no longer just a medium for writing. It is becoming a technology of security. It's building the infrastructure for a new kind of economy, one based on credit, contracts, and verifiable promises. This Italian paper, strong, reliable, and bearing its own ghost-like proof of origin, is about to meet a machine that will amplify its power a millionfold. But before we get to that machine, let's return to our merchant, Wei, shivering in the courtyard in Kanbalik. The paper in his hand is the pinnacle of Chinese technology, but it's part of a system the Italians would have found terrifying. This wasn't a bill of exchange, a promise between two merchants. This was Chao, the paper currency of the Yuan dynasty. It was a command. The Song dynasty before them had experimented with paper money, but it was Kublai Khan and the Mongols who perfected it as an instrument of absolute state control. The system was brutal in its simplicity. All gold and silver in the empire was to be handed over to the state. In exchange, the people received these mulberry bark notes. To refuse them was treason. The penalties were final. Marco Polo, who served in Kublai Khan's court, described it with astonishment, writing that with this paper, the Khan could buy anything and everything, that his treasury was bottomless. To make this system work, the Mongols relied on another masterpiece of logistics, the yam. A vast network of post stations stretching across Asia. Imagine a courier, a leather-clad rider with a paisi, a golden tablet of authority, hanging from his neck. He gallops into a fortified station, his horse lathered in sweat. Before the animal has even stopped, a fresh mount is waiting. He swaps horses and is gone in a cloud of dust, carrying a pouch of sealed orders and paper notes. This network allowed Kublai Khan's commands, printed on paper in his capital, to move faster than any army. An order to levy troops in Persia, an order to release grain from a granary in the steppe, an order to pay a garrison on the edge of the Siberian forest, all could be transmitted with breathtaking speed. It was a nervous system for a continent-spanning empire, with paper as its neurotransmitter. For a time, it worked. The sheer power and military might of the Mongols compelled acceptance. The merchant Wei, faced with the officer's cold stare, had no real choice. He had to accept the paper. The grain carts would roll. The army would be fed. The empire's will was done. But what happens when the fear fades? What happens when the promise printed on the paper starts to feel thin? History is a graveyard of broken promises. And the story of paper money is a lesson in how quickly trust can turn to dust. In the final decades of the Yuan dynasty, Kublai Khan's successors faced constant warfare and internal rebellions. Their solution? Print more money. And more. And more. They ran the workshops day and night, flooding the empire with chow. But printing more notes didn't create more grain or more silk. It just meant that each note was worth less. This is inflation, and it is a poison. A peasant who sold his harvest for a stack of notes found that by the time he went to the market, they could barely buy a bag of salt. A soldier who received his pay in paper found it was worthless. People lost faith in the Khan's seal. They started hoarding what little silver and copper they could find, refusing the government's paper. The system, once a marvel of efficiency, buckled and then collapsed. The Deming Tongxing Baoqiao of the succeeding Ming dynasty suffered the same fate. An attempt to replace metal currency entirely with paper was met with an inflationary death spiral. By the mid-15th century, Ming officials were being paid their salaries in stacks of paper that were effectively useless. The great paper money experiment in China died without a eulogy, abandoned in favor of the cold, reliable certainty of silver. Fast forward 300 years to revolutionary France. The new government, desperate for funds, issues a new kind of paper money, the assignat. It's backed not by the promise of a king, but by the value of land seized from the church. It is, they claim, as good as gold. At first, it is the oxygen of the revolution, funding the new republic's armies. But they make the same mistake. Faced with endless war and turmoil, they print more. And more. And more. The value of the assignat plummets. A Parisian housewife holding a note that could buy a loaf of bread one week finds it can't buy a single slice the next. The result is rage. Riots. The street answers the printing press with the guillotine. In both Yuan China and revolutionary France, the rulers learned a hard lesson. You can force people to accept paper at the point of a sword, but you cannot force them to trust it. And when that trust evaporates, the paper becomes nothing more than fuel for a fire. But paper isn't just about promises. It's about memory. And sometimes, the most effective act of war is to erase it. February, 1258. The Mongols are at the gates of Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city falls. What follows is one of the most catastrophic acts of cultural destruction in human history. The great libraries, including the legendary House of Wisdom, are systematically destroyed. Chroniclers write that the invaders threw so many books into the Tigris River that the water ran black with ink. This may be a poetic exaggeration, but the reality was just as devastating. This wasn't just the burning of books, it was the shredding of a state's brain. Tax rolls, property deeds, legal records, census data, military ledgers, all gone. Without these records, the new rulers were flying blind. How do you tax a population you can't count? How do you supply a garrison when you've lost the supply routes? How do you govern a land whose memory you have just incinerated? An empire doesn't just run on soldiers and grain, it runs on information. By destroying Baghdad's archives, the Mongols weren't just punishing a defeated foe, they were performing an act of administrative decapitation. They were making the city, and the empire it commanded, forget itself. This brutal lesson echoes through history. In every conflict since, the archive has been a target. To control the future, you must often control the past. And the easiest way to control the past is to burn the paper it's written on. Now, back to Europe. The year is 1450. In a workshop in Mainz, Germany, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg has finally perfected his invention. He has married the strong, reliable rag paper of Italy with a new, oil-based ink and a modified wine press. The result is the printing press. And it is about to change the world forever. Before Gutenberg, a book was a rare, precious object, copied by hand over months or years by a patient monk. Now, hundreds, or even thousands, of copies of a text could be produced in a matter of weeks. The effect is explosive. But the true power of the press is unleashed 70 years later, by a stubborn monk named Martin Luther. When Luther nails his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg in 1517, he's starting a theological debate. But thanks to the printing press, he starts a firestorm. His tracts, pamphlets, and German translation of the Bible fly off the presses. They are written not in the Latin of the church, but in the German of the common people. They are cheap, easy to conceal, and they spread like a virus. Between 1517 and 1525, more than 1 million pamphlets ripped through the German states. The Pope in Rome issues edicts condemning Luther. The printers print the edicts, but they also print 10 times as many of Luther's replies. For the first time in history, an institution's monopoly on information is shattered by technology. The battlefield is no longer just on the fields of Flanders, it's in the print shops of Nuremberg and Strasbourg. Princes and preachers are now fighting for the allegiance of millions, not with swords, but with cheap sheets of paper. This is information warfare in its infancy. The press has turned paper from a tool of administrative control into a weapon of mass persuasion. It gives a single voice the power to move a continent. And the world will never be the same. The empires of the New World were built on this power. The Spanish and Habsburg empires stitched their vast, ocean-spanning territories together with paper. Royal edicts, or cedulas, crossed the Atlantic, carrying orders to viceroys in Mexico and Peru. Inquisitorial files documented heresy in terrifying detail. Endless reports from inspectors, or visitas, made their way back to the archives in Seville. Paper was the leash that held the New World, and the sea was just the distance between filing cabinets. A century later, the British in India would perfect this into an art form, creating what became known as the File Raj, the rule by file. Every aspect of life was documented, categorized, and filed. Petitions, survey maps, revenue settlements, police reports. A person's life could be decided by the stroke of a pen on a dusty file. A bad memo could be the difference between a village receiving famine relief or suffering foreclosure. A signature became a scythe. In all these cases, paper performed 3 critical functions. It was proof of ownership, of identity, of law. It was a promise of payment, of justice, of salvation. And it was propaganda, a tool for shaping belief, for justifying rule, for making power seem inevitable. When these 3 functions align, an empire can move with terrifying unity. But when they shear apart, when the proof is revealed to be a lie, the promise is broken, and the propaganda fails, the entire structure collapses. So what is the verdict of our investigation? It's this: trust is the scarcest and most critical supply line of any civilization. The system always comes down to a moment of decision, like the one our merchant Wei faced in that frozen courtyard. He rolled the carts. He had to. But the moment the threat of the sword becomes the only reason to trust the paper, the system is already dying. The story of paper is the story of this trust. It shows us how a transfer of technology, like the captured artisans at Talas, can give a state a new memory, a new hard drive. It shows us how multiplication, like Gutenberg's press, can make messages viral and turn narrative control into a logistical battle. And it shows us how overreach, like the printing presses of the Yuan or revolutionary France, can destroy trust faster than it can print notes. The cost of this failure is always reckoned in 3 ways. In blood, from grain caravans that never arrive, leading to starving garrisons and mutinies. In treasure, from the economic ruin of hyperinflation, where a lifetime of savings becomes worthless overnight. And in reputation, because one broken paper promise poisons the next 1,000, making it impossible to govern. If this all feels like ancient history, look around you. We still live in the empire of paper, it has just gone digital. That money in your bank account? It's not a pile of gold in a vault. It's a digital entry in a ledger, a promise from a central bank. When confidence in that promise wobbles, entire markets convulse. Your passport, your driver's license, your birth certificate, your property deed. What are these but modern-day sealed edicts? They are pieces of paper, or their digital twins, that grant you the right to move, to own, to exist in the eyes of the state. And information warfare? From Luther's pamphlets to today's social media platforms, the physics is unchanged. Cheap, rapid duplication shatters monopolies on truth, and states and corporations scramble to control the logistics of belief. The burning of archives continues. Only now, it's not libraries being put to the torch, but servers being wiped, databases being hacked, and digital records being altered or erased. The ledgers of power still burn, but they do so without smoke. We have simply gotten faster at creating, transmitting, and destroying our proofs and promises. But the fundamental bargain remains the same. We fail to understand this at our peril. We must see how proof, promise, and propaganda interlock. We have to recognize the second that the ink of authority turns into the liability of a broken trust. The sheet that moved a grain caravan in 1294 operates on the exact same principle that moves markets, launches aid convoys, and decides elections today. When belief is earned, the system works. When it is coerced, the convoy eventually tips into the ditch. The investigation never ends. The files are never closed. For the next case, click the video on your end screen right now for another deep dive investigation into the hidden systems that run our world. And to become part of the investigation team, subscribe for daily deep dives. We have a lot of ground to cover. Now, for the final question. Look in your own wallet, on your own hard drive. What's the one piece of paper, physical or digital, you couldn't live without?